Thank you so much for that really nice introduction. Yeah, thank you to the art department for inviting me here. I have a little bit, I'm recovering from a cold, and I have like a 6-week-old daughter, so I'm like, did not sleep much last night, and I'm on the edge. So hopefully this will go all right. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about, start with sort of the design part, talk about my sort of influences in design practice, and then kind of get into the art projects, and talk a little bit about how they interact with each other. And I really go heavy on the images for this stuff, so there's like a lot, but I won't ever stay too long on any one thing. My background is I did not go to undergrad or graduate school for art or design or anything else that I do. I went to undergrad for like media studies, but not like the fun kind they do here, like the kind you just write about media. And so I realized all the stuff I wanted to do right when I was graduating from college, and I just, instead of going back to school, I just started like learning on the job and doing self-started projects, and kind of one thing led to another. But I did grow up, my father taught design history at Buff State, he was an art historian, so I was exposed to a lot of stuff as a kid. And these are 3 posters that I grew up with that had like a big influence on me, that I like was exposed to this sort of like late mid-century graphic design, and it really stuck with me. It's a Polish poster on the far left there. It's an exhibition poster of Roy Lichtenstein's show in Denmark in the middle, and then this is for the Danish railway system from 1975. And these are posters that were always around, although my dad never framed them. I finally framed them like after 45 years. I think these are kind of like a key to the things that, like kind of how I think about things, and I think you'll see it reflected in my work. Another influence is and if you follow me on Instagram, you'll know, I'm very into mid-century graphic design, particularly book covers. And I started blogging about those back in 2009, and then it became part of my Instagram account when that started. So, and you'll see how I design real book covers and fake book covers and all this stuff as we go on. But I'm very interested in this certain style of modernism. This is like from the early 60s. Rudolf Zaharak on the end there, John and Mary Condon, a husband and wife design team in the middle, and then this is Germano Fischetti, who did a lot of work for Penguin. But this era, there's a lot of really just high concept design for book covers, but also like far more minimal than we're likely to see today. And there's some kind of like intangible quality of these things I think I'm always kind of have in my mind, I'm kind of trying to repeat or access in some way. Like this cover really for me is something, I can't quite put my finger on how to talk about it, but like it has some quality I'm like reaching for in a way that's I can't quite articulate. And I think sometimes a lot of the work I'm doing, I think I have an idea in my head that I can't quite get to. And part of the process is trying to find a way to kind of realize this inclination that I have. So these are just some examples of the kinds of posters that I do and design. I've worked for all kinds of clients, a lot on the cultural side. A couple of these are for UB from the past. I also have for years done work for just Buffalo Literary Center. Less now than I used to, but I still design their Babel series where they bring 4 authors every season. So this is like, I think we're in like year 15 of that or something. So each year I basically redesign the look of that and the whole promotional campaign. The Buffalo Humanities Festival is a festival that comes out of UB that I guess is in year 9. But I've designed the identity, each year it's a theme, and I've designed the graphic for each year. I mean, these aren't the full posters, this is just an example of like the title and the graphic, but you know, so each year it's sort of a challenge to try to kind of encompass that complex idea in a single graphic. This is something I did for the 50th anniversary year of the architecture department here. So this is more like nitty gritty of like really laying out information. And a lot of what I do these days is much more the stuff graphic designers like to do, which is book covers, record covers, posters. And for the most part, people at this point are coming to me for the image making more than anything else. So I don't do many jobs where it's, I mean, I do lay out books every once in a while, but luckily I don't have to do the things that I find less interesting, or you know, don't work to my, I'm worse at, basically. So these are just a few recent book covers. But again, image making is usually at the center of this. I sometimes do editorial illustrations. I did a series during COVID for The Atlantic where I was illustrating a medical column that was almost all questions about COVID. So for like 6 months, I basically did a COVID illustration every week, which is just interesting because I like honed this really specific skill that doesn't so it doesn't need to be used anymore. I also do a lot of music stuff. Not a lot, but I was like many people, particularly my age, I was really interested in graphic design because of record covers and CD covers and that sort of thing. Although somehow I didn't really get going doing this stuff until I was like doing actual record cover design until I was like almost 40. So it's sort of a weird path because usually it's kind of like a young man's game. But I'm lucky now that like sort of interesting people reach out to me. And one of the things I always wanted to do, and I've now done twice, is design like a whole series where the look is kind of coherent across a series of records. So this is a Berlin-based label called Series of Phonos that, I mean, I did, I think maybe 9 records for them, all kind of in the same style, related style. Also interested in sort of the whole package. One of the most prestigious things that I've worked on, I'm still working on, is I do the graphic design for Jazz is Dead, which is a record label started by Ali Shaheed Muhammad from Tribe Called Quest and Adrian Young. And we've done 20 records together. And they have an analog studio in LA where they invite older jazz guys and Brazilian musicians to come and record these albums. And it's a whole like 10, they come in chunks of 10. So it's just that they reached out to me kind of out of the blue, and I created like the identity for them, like the packaging, a lot of the merch. Like this is a poster, a screen printed poster, like 11 colored screen printed poster we did for the first 9 records. But these are all like very major dudes in the world of jazz. This is some festival design I did for the Nuit Sonoris Festival in Lyon, France. One of the cooler like gigs I've ever had, in that it's like they flew me over there for the festival and like this electronic music festival. And as an American designer, a lot of the time you're like designing like 11 by 17 posters to be like, hung up at the co-op or whatever. But there it's like European size stuff. So like they have like big poster slots everywhere. It was very cool to like turn up in Lyon and just like see this thing I designed everywhere. And you might have seen these buses around town. This is for Just Buffalo and their collaboration with the NFTA, where they had poems on buses. But I'm doing a little more vehicle stuff these days. This is some like interior graphics for a music publishing company in Manhattan. So it's hard to see. The middle slide is like you're looking down a narrow hallway where I've done this not painted, but it's graphics that printed graphics that sort of like balance out this hall. Also for the same company, I did this graphic in one of their meeting rooms. So those are just sort of my sort of standard client-based work, what that looks like. I also make work that is sort of in between. It's not part of my contemporary art practice, but it's self-motivated and it's not designed for science and illustration. But this is the sort of thing I sort of sell online. And I'm interested in making stuff for a whole, like this is aimed at kids, of course. But I'm interested in sort of working in a lot of different zones. Like I want to be able to make things that are just like fun stuff, basically. And there are a lot of like people, sort of mid-century artists and designers, or people, artists and designers that I admire. Like Bruno Munari is a big one, the Italian artist and designer, where he did, really interesting experimental art. He did like children's books. He did all kinds of, just a huge range of things. And that's kind of how I think about my like overlapping practices. There's like the contemporary art with conceptual projects. There's the client work. And then there's just sort of this image making that's in between. It's much more for like, I guess, a popular audience, you would say. And some, things like just things I'm interested in doing. And I've always like drawn birds since I was a kid. So I'm just interested in making these satisfying kind of colorful compositions. And these are all prints that I sell online. Sometimes projects then generate clients just after I've started them on my own. So I'd originally did a series of posters that were illustrating 1970s cars, all in this particular style. And sorry, 1 second. And I was selling those, and then I was asked by this this arts graphic design organization in the Netherlands. They curate this 52 poster slots in this Rem Koolhaas designed parking garage. So they asked me if I wanted to do my like car series there, which I'd only done 20 cars, but then I did the rest of the 50. I made it 52 cars, and this is you would drive through, and they would go from, each one is different on each side. but they go from red to blue and then back again. So this is somewhere sort of in between, sort of a designy art installation kind of thing. But then Continental Tires asked me to work on this campaign where I would illustrate cars in that style for their, what they call it, the heroes of something. I mean, it's all cars that rolled out of the factory with Continental Tires from like 1901 to the present. And they like even sent like a film crew here to do like a short little documentary about me. And it was all very cool. Supposed to go to Germany, but then like COVID happened and it kind of just all that fell apart. But it's a big campaign in Europe that was going to be using these posters. So that's an example of where something I'd made on my own had just then generated the client work or became a client thing. And there's a lot of back and forth between those streams. And then also I do kind of collaborations, like this is with the sticker company where I did a series of stickers that are just based on the various little graphics from all different aspects of my work. Similarly, I have a collaboration with Casetify, the cell phone case company in China, I think they're in Hong Kong. So I have designs through them as well. So that's just like a rapid fire like through that section of work. So now we'll move on to like the art story. That I sort of need, that's all kind of context and just sort of has to be put in its own section. I've been talking about myself all summer because I had this show at the Birchfield. So I've been giving tours and just talking, and it's very weird, like, because I sort of been trying to formulate this like narrative of my career and life and everything, and it's very strange. And every time I like start to tell the story, I just sort of pause and then tell it a different way each time. So I don't ever. So I'm doing that right now. I'm pausing before I start. But I'll tell this. How I got started in art, or my first real artwork, was in 1997 when I was living in Dublin after college and had a work visa to be there for. I'd been in England for 6 months on a work visa, and then I was in Ireland for 7 months. And hanging out with some people who recently graduated from art school. And I knew I wanted to do more art stuff, and I knew I wanted to learn about design. And I was working as a bike messenger at the time. So these guys were really into the book as art, and I'd always been fascinated by, or always been liked books and the book as an object, and I liked the idea of the book as art. So this is a book I made of paper cuts of bird beaks. There's 60 different beaks in this book, and they're all numbered, but they're not named. And this was in an exhibition, exhibition in Wexford, Ireland, of artist books in 1997. But this was like the first piece I actually like put out there as art. Even I'd been in other things as a younger person and so forth. This was like my first like professional kind of thing. And I include it here because it weirdly encapsulates, it sort of has DNA in it that is through the rest of my career. Like this idea of like kind of a system that's not particularly, maybe a slightly mysterious system or sort of a system of order around the natural world, kind of taking something that seems kind of familiar but making it weird by doing kind of these, focusing on the beak just and all the other 60 different beaks, and they kind of get weird. They're sort of strange as you flip through them because they're so odd, kind of isolated on their own. And then the kind of the black and white, the paper cuts, the hard lines, like all that's, and just the book itself. It all really is like kind of what a lot of the rest of my work ends up kind of accessing. So I've come to think, in the process of doing this, we'll talk about my mid-career retrospective at the end, but it's like an interesting process. Even though I'm a pretty reflective person, but as you go through this stuff, you don't really stand back from these projects that you're doing as you make them. And it's interesting to stand back from a distance and then sort of really understand like how you keep repeating yourself, or how you're kind of always leaning one way or the other. And I kind of come to think that like what an artist is like a set of kind of inclinations, or like kind of like directions that you're being pulled, that you kind of keep like translating in different ways. Certainly that feels like the case for myself. But once I got back to Buffalo after being in Ireland and England in late 97, I got a job as a sort of paid intern at the Museum of Science, working on science education materials. I sort of started learning graphic design. And I ended up starting a project that I originally started just to kind of just to make something so I could do, work on my design and maybe work on a little bit of conceptual stuff. But I was driving through the intersection of Hurdle and Delaware and Hurdle. I was driving with the woman I was dating at the time, who was a photo student at Buff State. And I noticed there were shopping carts like everywhere, like every lawn, like turned upside down at the bus stop, just like all over the place. And I was like, oh, there's something interesting here. Like maybe you should photograph them. And she wasn't interested. So that, well, maybe I'll photograph them. But I knew that if I just photographed shopping carts and that was it, then it would just read in kind of a one-dimensional way of like, here's like a sad statement about consumerism, or here's a kind of like, just these sort of like rote ideas about like urban decay. So I thought like, well, what would happen if I tried to figure out like what is happening to these cards, like where they're going to, where they're coming from, like what state are they in? So this is in a Buffalo zine, a really influential zine called Basta. I think this is from 1999 or 2000. And this is the first iteration of my, what I then called transient urban structure, that would later be called the stray shopping cart system, identification system. But this, I came up with a set of states that a cart could be in. There were two classes. They're true, false strays. Those are carts that go out from where they're from and then come back. And then there are false strays that go out and come back. And there are true strays that go out and then never come back. And then there's subdivisions of each one of those. So I'll get into like the further system in a second. But so it was a way of identifying the situation that a cart was in and sort of give it a name to that state. So this proved to be like kind of a really important concept to create a project, or it kind of like helped unfold. It gave me a mission to go on to like understand what was happening. And there's way less cart activity now. Like at the time in the late 90s, they were like kind of everywhere. And this cart system eventually became this, which is, it's of 33 different types. It's still the same two classes. And this was something that, this is around 2006, I sort of finalized the system. This is what it looked like in the end. And then that became a book and all these sorts of things that I'll talk about in a minute. But I'm just going to walk through like what the system is very quickly. So as I said, a false stray is a cart that is either diverted from its primary function or damaged on the lot that it's on, or one that it goes out and sort of comes back some distance. Now you can't always know what a false stray is because you don't know the future of the cart, but in theory this works, right? This is a ridiculous system, but it actually works in the sense that it's truthful. And all my documentation is truthful as well. Like I didn't pose anything. So it's close false, that's very like close to the source being the store that it comes from. Plaza drift, it's sort of on adjacent concrete, the cart is sort of moved along. There's bus stop discard, where people take the cart to the bus, then take their stuff on the bus and leave the cart. Sometimes they sit on it on the side. Damaged, well, yeah, that's actually damaged at source, self-explanatory. I'm just going to go through all this quickly. Being crushed by snow plows is like a big thing that happens around here, and creates a certain kind of damage. Fragments that's less than 50% of like the original cart. The mixed group is people sort of gather carts that are like nuisances and all put them in one place, and kind of they get in these zones, or what I call like peripheral spaces. They sort of get ganged up, so you just see this big mess of like damaged carts from all different stores. It's a mixed group. Some are true strays, some are false strays. It's all over the place. Remote false, it's the one that's far away but will eventually come back. The alternative usage, you can see here they're using the carts to keep the snow plow from blocking the drain with the snow. So they're like tied up with the caution tape. And then true strays, which is the bigger sort of category. There's an open true, which could be kind of become anything. It's like damaged, fragment, on as personal property. That's when someone takes a cart and uses it for themselves, which is very common. On as business property, it's where it's used for a purpose that isn't the normal use of a cart. Assimilated, where a cart is sort of, a foreign cart is sort of infiltrated like a group of carts at a store. Transient imposter, it's sort of mixing in like plaza drift. Structurally modified, there's a lot of this you see when you look for it. You realize people are like, this is an example of that, but like people will actually just saw the tops or bottoms off of carts and then build new carts because they're such a practical, like well-built thing. So there's all this kind of weird activity around that, where you'll find like the top of a cart that's been like cleanly cut. Snow immobilization, which leads to like a plow crush. Train damage, like it's so catastrophic when it gets hit by a train that it's like its own category. Simple vandalism is like vandalism that's really only like a couple steps, like an impulsive act. But then complex vandalism is like more premeditated, like you have to do 3 or 4 things to get the cart into that position. It's archaic, that's when the store that it came from is closed, so it's just sort of out there in the world on its own. Gap marginalization, like these sort of marginal spaces where people are just trying to get things out of the way. And edge marginalizations where like you just throw it over the fence. Like if you go down like Niagara Falls Boulevard, like there's really no carts there, but if you look behind the fences, everyone's throwing them on the other side, so it's like there'll be a pile of them there. Remote group. As refuse receptacle, people often like just throw the trash in the cart, so it kind of becomes a trash can. It gets thrown out itself, gets sort of bulldozed and like rehabilitated, when they're redoing an area, particularly old creeks and things. Naturalization is when it kind of is just like kind of sucked back into the earth, basically. And the wheel lock stray is self-explanatory. So part of my project also, like a big, and these are pages from my new book, which is the new version of this shopping cart book, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the Skidjackwada Creek, which is runs by Buff State, is where I took a lot of photographs of carts and sort of did, in my new book, I have a whole study of just like the activity on Skidjackwada Creek from around 2006. So this project I started in '99, and it kind of grew and sort of caught on in this funny way where I had gotten into several different exhibitions just from sending like my outline of the project and sort of the work that I'd made so far. And one of those was Real Artways in Hartford, Connecticut, which is like the hall walls of Hartford. And that show ended up getting written about in the New York Times, and then that led to me getting represented by a gallery in New York, and the work ended up being seen in a lot of different places. These are just some other examples of cart photographs. That's in the Lafayette Hotel before they like redid it. But looking in from the Buffalo Public Library, you can see this cart like stuck in a back room. This is the show I had like in Brooklyn in like 2004. I would sometimes bring carts like into the space too. Like I excavated this one and like brought it in the dirt that it was into the space. And initially I was just like printing out stuff on the printer that I had and like hanging that in the gallery, like when I didn't have the money to like do larger prints. But the project proved to be it was interesting. People really took the time to read it, and like because I think it was something that they understood. I think what I learned with the project is that it was taking something in the world that people knew and then kind of like doing this weird thing to it so that like people identify or could relate to it. Like they all knew what a shopping cart was, but then like this language was sort of like funny because it was done in such a serious way that it was sort of identifying this thing that they hadn't articulated for themselves. So it also had the effect of, the project initially for me was about kind of exploring this sort of urban space, and then about kind of the way that taxonomies work in order. But ultimately what it became about was the way that language shapes the way that we see things. Because people would come back to me and say like, oh, now I see shopping carts, stray shopping carts everywhere. And the reason they see them now is because they know someone made up this system to like name them. So when you see it, you wonder, well, what's the name of that cart? And even if it's like they think it's stupid, they still sort of can't not think it. So it was interesting to me in the way that like the process of naming kind of created this cognitive process that made people see what they couldn't see before and see into these peripheral spaces and these spaces that they've normally ignored. In a lot of ways, that's what I want art to do in general, is to sort of like alert me to some other way of seeing something, or to like see into some sort of space that I couldn't see before. And I think a lot of other people like the project because they see it as more about social issues or environmental issues or all those other things. And I think that's all in there. And then the value of the project, or the artistic part of the art of the project, is the individual photographs and the kind of like tone and the energy that those have and how those function. So I think all those levels together are kind of what make the project work. This is a poster that I made in the pre-social media days. I made this poster outlining the project, and on the other side there's an essay from when I had a show like the catalog I did for a show at Hallwalls. But my idea was, this is a folding poster with the whole system, and I kind of wanted it to like go viral by just like handing it out to people when I was doing stuff with my gallery in New York. And that worked. And someone from Abrams Publishing approached me and asked me if I wanted to do a book of this project. And like that's exactly what I wanted to do. So they'd taken the poster to the editors, and the editors approached me. So like, it was like that little piece of self-promotion was super useful. So this book came out in 2006, and I designed the whole thing myself. I did make some compromises on the cover, but it was published in it's in the voice of the project. So it's like me as this alternative version of Julian Montague, who only cares about organizing shopping carts, is the voice in the book, and it doesn't ever say it's not a guide to shopping carts. But however, it was published by Abrams, which is a big company, And they sort of like put it, this is a time when all these sort of like quirky books were big, like it's like how to survive this or that. And so it kind of got stuck in the humor category, which wasn't like super useful, like not in the art book section or not in these other places I'd like to be in the bookstore. Back when bookstores were a much more kind of critical way of reaching people, like, Borders and Barnes and Noble, all that. But nevertheless, it did actually get a lot of press. Like, you see down at the bottom, there's like, it says stray shopping carts, and they like Nelly Furtado here on the cover. But this magazine, like, gave me 4 pages of like shopping cart content. There's like a piece in the New York Times. This is the local piece. One man's garbage, another man's artistic treasure. Like, not the best headline writing, really, but I think it was funny. And then I won this. So then what happened is my book was nominated for this thing they do every year, what's the oddest book title of 2006. So like they put up like 5 weird titles and then everyone votes on it. So people voted for mine, and I won this prize. So it's like ridiculous. It's just like stupid that like, it's who has the strangest title. And people picked me, but it was this like real 15 minutes of fame thing where like I was being like interviewed on the BBC and all over the place, and stories like this where it's like, office trolley, that's what they call them in England, author who won the oddest book award. So it put me in the situation where I was being like interviewed, and I'd have to be like, no, it's a conceptual art project, and this is like how, it was good. I mean, any press is sort of good press in a way, but people wanted to like talk to like a lunatic who wrote a book about shopping carts as opposed to like, an artist who was like making this kind of, funny but also serious kind of project. And then the book kind of got like lumped into these like articles about like weird books. So this is like in The Guardian, which is like, a great newspaper, but it's like, it's in here with like this stuff. And then this is like the Daily Mail, like bestsellers they ain't. And it's like, my book is down there with all these other weird books. But the good part of the story is that I was approached by the University of Chicago Press last year, or the year before last, to do a new version of the book. So I went back and like completely redesigned it. I was able to like go back and scan negatives or like make different choices and kind of like make the book the best, to my mind, best possible version it could be, with the sort of 16 years of hindsight and like kind of what I've learned about art and design. So it's still like basically the same, but like I was able to make it better, I think. So that came out in October, and is currently, on the, some loud snoring. But a very cool thing this time around is I was able to like get all these. Anyway, it was cool that this time I could get like all these like killer blurbs for the back, and it was like I was able to like that all acknowledge that it's crazy, but also like kind of take it seriously, which is sort of a fun thing to be able to do. Like I have a Nobel Prize winning scientist on here, like commenting on like the value of the book. So when I finished this project, I decided to working on the shopping cart project. When you work on like a project-oriented artist, there's a thing where people are always asking you, what are you going to do next? Like kind of like, what's the next thing you're going to pay attention to? Or, are you going to do traffic cones next or whatever? And in retrospect, like I probably jumped off that shopping cart wave too early, and I probably should have milked it for another couple of years, because like it was like selling and it was like getting attention and so forth. But I felt this pressure to like not be just the guy who does shopping carts, essentially. So I started thinking about like what I wanted to do next, and because I felt like it would have been really interesting to like explore this peripheral space in the urban environment, and like kind of in the form of an investigation, and go out and explore all these places. I thought, well, what's the like version of that in a kind of interior space? And I thought that it was like spiders and other sort of ultimately other insects and so forth as well. But like spiders are kind of everywhere, in every room you'll ever be in, there's a spider. It's just like part of like what happens, like how things are. And we don't think about them very much. But these other whole dramas and lives are happening like all around us. And so what I did was I did a lot of macro photography and a lot of like looking around. But ultimately I was collecting spiders, like preserving them in jars. And then I'd look at them through a microscope, make a drawing of their face, and then make these fabric banners of their faces, and then hang them in the spot where I photographed them, or where I found them. So this was kind of these drawings of spider faces, they're kind of, if you look at an arachnology book, they do sometimes use these to show where the eye placement is and the way the jaws work and stuff. And what I thought was interesting about them is that they are so hard to anthropomorphize. Like, they don't look like faces to us, and it's hard to like make them seem human in the way that we kind of like look at a puppy or something, and you make it kind of like, you sort of impose sort of human qualities onto it. And spiders resist that as these kind of weird little aliens. And so these banners sort of hanging here are marking this alien presence, and as this kind of like ironic memorial to the spider that had been collected. And I was interested in these mundane spaces. Like, this is my aunt's garage in Florida, and I like the idea of just kind of like marking this space with what's really happening there, which is this activity of spiders. So these are all things I shot on medium format, and they printed. The prints were like something like 40-something inches wide by 30-something high, but a great level of detail. And some of them inside, outside, but like all kind of on buildings or around buildings. This is like a picnic shelter in Florida. This is where I shot a bunch of stuff in Florida because it was cold here, and I wanted in the winter here, and I wanted to try to get in stuff before the show in New York. And there were some species I really wanted to find in the South. But and this is just a few stills from the exhibit I had, which is called "To Know the Spiders," which is a sort of, there's an arachnology guide called "How to Know the Spiders." So it's sort of this idea of getting to know these animals that are all around us. These fabric banners all hanging here, so you can see the variety of the different sort of faces. And this is all with felt cut out and then ironed on with an adhesive onto black canvas. So I did this section of the project, and then I kind of felt like it's an interesting area, and there's ways to expand it. And I kind of, the way that the shopping cart project had like an author, this version of me as the author a voice I sort of wrote through. I thought the same could be done, not done the same way, but I realized I could kind of imagine a fictional author at the center of this sort of the spider investigation. And at the time I'd been blogging, there was this time around 2009 where lots of like blogs were kind of a newer thing, and people were doing these things where like they were going to post a picture every single day for a year and stuff like that. And a friend of mine was doing that with books, like he was just taking books off his shelf and doing like a book a day for a year. And I started doing that too because I'd bought a lot of books I just liked for the graphics and just the design of them. And so I started doing that, and I did it for like 2 years. I posted a book cover every day, like stuff I'd find at thrift stores, that kind of thing. But over time, like I got really into, like what I showed you before was that mid-century modern stuff, which I'd always kind of liked. But by looking at like so many books, it really refined my eye. And like there was like stuff where before I was like kind of interested in this like kitsch stuff, and stuff was like a little outside of that. And I really started to see things differently. And so it was really steeped in this style of graphic design. And so I thought that like an interesting thing I could do is I could make these fake books that were the reading materials for my fictional author, so that I could like, as a way of kind of putting these ideas that I had associated with this project, like kind of into the mind of the viewer by presenting them as a book. So I took old library books, and with the plastic covers on them, and I took out their old covers and I printed new covers, and I made up the graphics, made up the names, everything. So then when you stick them back in, they look really realistic, like as an object. Like it just looks like a real book. And that, I think, was kind of like a breakthrough in some ways in my work, because it became this format. I also did paperbacks, which I sort of like manipulated. It didn't work as easily as the other ones. But where I could kind of take these like weird ideas that I wanted kind of associated with this idea of the intersection of animals and architecture, like particularly invertebrates, and then put them into this like book form. And with this authoritative voice of this like modernist, scholars, essentially. And it created this space where I could just like play out a lot of ideas. So when these are shown in the gallery along with that other work, with the spider band and the other thing, it's sort of a way that like the viewer is getting these things that these ideas you want them to have in their head that they take to the rest of the work. So it's almost like you could take ideas from an artist statement but put them on these book covers, and that's like a way of sort of, even when you know it's fake, you kind of like have to think of what would that book be about, and it kind of takes you on this like little trip of like thinking about what that could be. And because it's sitting there as a book, and like the pages are just from whatever, it's from whatever library book I thought was the right size. But I think it kind of created this cool effect. And then weirdly, like with my New York gallery, like we like presented these at art fairs and so forth, like, and they sold, like people bought them kind of as sculptural objects, which was surprising. And this book, Managing Structural Bird Problems, like this art group in Germany ended up using it as this like sort of prompt for this whole project with all these people. And one thing led to another, and we all did this like really crazy show in Germany, kind of that this was the starting point for. But I mean, that's too complicated to talk about. But anyway, so I was also like using, these are all like photographs. I mean, I did almost no appropriation for this project. Like, I mean, these are all photographs I took, or graphics I generated one way or the other, or paintings I made in that case. But so there's everything from like fictional. These are like playwrights, and some are like this is about macro filmmaking. Just all these just like adjacent things I was interested in, I can kind of put into this space. Like a science fiction book, Larvonicus. So, and inside this project, which I won't go into, there's a whole nother story about a cult that sort of is worried about the end of the world and studies bees. But that's a whole other thing. But in the books could be displayed in all kinds of different ways, like sort of in a glass case or on a shelf, or as you'll see in my recent exhibition, just sort of like laid out on tables. So that was like, excuse me. So that opening up that door to making this fictional stuff was really a turning point, because I was able to use the sort of graphic design stuff, like do in the style I really liked, and then it was so open and free. And it's so different from like making a real book cover, because sometimes I just have like the image in my head, and then I'd make up the title, which is never how you design anything. So it is not really like doing graphic design in that way. It's sort of using graphic design as a tool. So through the course of this project, which also involves, I did like some other related to the spiders, like some posters and some record covers and so forth. Well, one of them was for a fictional art gallery, and they called the Thorold Gallery, which is like an exit on the QEW, like near Niagara Falls, Thorold, Ontario. Just randomly used that name. But I realized I could then make, at one point I realized, well, maybe this fake gallery that I've used for a couple posters could just be its own project, basically, where I make exhibition posters for this gallery, this art institution that didn't exist, making the work myself, all sort of set in the 70s. So what was cool about that was I had all these like loose visual ideas I kind of wanted to put somewhere, kind of like semi-develop. And then these like exhibition posters were a way to do that. And I mean, this is one of the few appropriations, but that's a Bruegel print that I grew up being fascinated by. And like, this is just, some of these are just like shows I'd like to see, like 7 Centuries of Fish and Art. And the other one, like, I designed on a train when I did this, but just the idea that like there were enough photographs from trains to do like some exhibition of them from like 1860 whatever to now is funny to me. So sometimes they're like these jokes, and then sometimes they're just like a visual idea I want to play out, and then sometimes they're sort of a kind of parody of that era. But they're not any one of those things exactly. More than anything, I'm just interested in kind of like the process of like thinking, what would that show look like? Like the modern animal in 1971. Like what would be in that? Excuse me. So this is like, I mean, there are like 100-something posters in this series, but it sort of keeps generating itself, like all these just ideas I can just kind of keep going with. And my friends also become then these artists. Well, this is Robert Harris, who you might know if you hang around Buffalo very long. And then sometimes they make things that are like deliberately boring, like Midwestern landscape photography, or monochromatic painting. But it's I think of it as just it was kind of a way of helping to kind of expand my studio practice by creating a conceptual space where I could play around with all these images and ideas. And then there are also some through lines of like different artists that show up at different times. But and then here, this, like, I also did a whole series of catalogs. So here I've taken a picture of the Albright Knox, and then I sort of superimposed my fictional artist's painting, like in the, so it looks like it's in the gallery. And then also associated with the Thorold Gallery are like lots more books and catalogs. And I'd sort of, this sort of foray into fiction was interesting because I mean, I've never been like a writer or anything, but you sort of understand the appeal of it where you like, or you understand what writers are talking about when they kind of like make one decision and applies the next decision, or kind of the way that things can kind of generate or write themselves. And that sort of felt like it happened with some of these things where I would, this fictional institution was very undefined, which is in England somewhere, the Thorold Gallery. But like at first it was just sort of like a smallish commercial gallery, and then it was like kind of a bigger museum, and then it's like, oh, maybe it has like I make a poster for a film and for a screening. It's like, oh, I guess it has a screening room, and then it has like a sculpture garden, and then it's like, so it sort of just can kind of just expand out infinitely because it doesn't exist. So it was sort of just feeling the pleasures of like, creating this fictional world, or like this series of architecture symposiums and these little booklets I made. The Thorold recording, series of records and so forth. And in my exhibition from the summer, I had two professors who were actually professors in real life, were playing fake professors. There's a video of them where they're talking about their memories of the Thorold Gallery. So they're actually talking about, like this record gets talked about, the Gary Tattersall record. So they're taking my fictional thing and then expanding that world in their own direction. Just sort of riffing on these ideas and talking about the various things that they imagine happened. So sometimes in the way that things sort of flip around, this Le Pleurant, which is like a French term for a weeping statue, is a picture of Kate Gowdy, who's a Buffalo artist. But she was actually laughing. I took this photograph for her exhibition. So in this fictional thing, I imagine her as a, some performance artist doing this like weeping thing. But then I was designing this book cover for Elisa Gabbert, and she wanted this image on the cover for this book. So then my sort of like weird little fake thing becomes like a book cover, which happened a few times. Like in this case, it's less specific, but like the Uncle Ass and the Deadbeats, like this like a doom metal band, they really wanted like the elements of this cover, you know what I mean, like kind of, but then combined with their own, they wanted this like head and camera and stuff. So it's like, a lot of times these things that I've made as art kind of feed into the graphic design part of things. So I started making these paintings for my fake artists. And I had this opportunity at the Henry, back in Resource Art was hanging art there, to like show some of these like, fake paintings that I'd made. So I did that, and then I like wrote this like thing explaining like how they're made as these like the artwork for these fictional artists and yada yada. But then I realized like as soon as they were like up on the wall, it's like you lose all like power to like control that narrative, and there's just like no one's gonna understand that or read that. So I'm like, well, and then the people bought the painting. So I'm like, well, I guess I'm like making paintings now. And I was like, but part of it I'd always resisted these like I'd always, I guess maybe not fully for the right reasons, but I just was always resistant to really traditional forms, and kind of always had my own ideas about things. Sometimes I was wrong in the long run, and sometimes I was right. But the idea of painting had never really appealed to me. But then I was like, well, I like spend a lot of time, kind of arranging colors and shapes, and like, why not? I'm as qualified as anybody else. So then I started making these paintings, and even though I sort of backed into it ironically, I did start to take it seriously. And in a weird way, it was an opening up of like, it was freeing in a way because everything I'd done up until that point had been so conceptually oriented, and there was really strict rules to the world I was in, that like making these paintings where just the painting is the painting and it sort of works on its own rules, was kind of, was sort of fun and sort of like a fun thing, or it opened up a lot of different doors. So I had this show, because I had this show Fictions, which is all my fake stuff in the Thorold Gallery, and then the next show I had at the same gallery, I did semi-fictions, which is like my paintings, and then that marked my entry into that, like back in 2018, I think it was. So I sort of have worked with this like I deliberately had a pretty restricted language of shapes that I worked with, and make tons and tons of sketches digitally using Illustrator. And then would eventually like make actual paintings. It was acrylic on canvas. It was a lot of like taping and so forth. And I don't make any great claims for this work, exactly, but I have been like sort of like letting it develop slowly, and I am starting to like think of these. I'm interested in, or I have this idea of almost, well, there's a sort of morbid interest in like Calvinist theology, which is the idea of like predestination and sort of like what the Puritans believed. And I'm sort of interested in like taking on like these like broad theological, I mean, I'd say that from an unbeliever's point of view. I'm sort of interested in trying to use this technique of painting to kind of like do some series that like portends to be like this like sort of theological addressment of these paradoxes, which I would do like sort of half ironically and half seriously, which I know sounds like a weird way to like pitch like an art idea, but that's what I'm thinking about. And so these paintings are, some of these are from like a few years ago and some are recent. But I've deliberately been fairly like strict with like what the limits of these sort of that world is. But I'm just like, as I go on, I sort of move it forward. So here when I was deinstalling this show, I like hung all this stuff and took all these pictures of it and arranged in different ways, and then like fold myself back into my fictional world. So it's kind of like everything loops around. So then then I started to get these opportunities to do kind of mural stuff. Or this is from. This is a playground, which is this thing that started in Medina, started by Buffalo people, but in this high school, disused high school in Medina, was a show of installations. And the first year I painted this is the second year, I'd already painted some of these things in this hallway, and then the next year I painted more. And so I was kind of like taking this language of shapes that I developed, but then I was like making them more like kid-friendly by sticking eyes on them. So it's sort of funny. There's this like sort of serious, austere paintings, but then I'm using some of the same stuff to then exist in this other like more sort of like, I don't know, friendly way towards. So it's sort of, I don't know. I guess it's a way of just continually undermining like the idea of serious painting. But so these are just different angles on this school painting. And then I got another opportunity in Medina, weirdly enough, to paint this building. And I did that also in this sort of like, like it's a bunch of monsters kind of way, but a lot of the same shapes that I've used for other things. And then I've done a few murals, like this is in Elmwood Franklin School, the lunchroom. And then this is at the Montessori School. And then that in turn led to me getting this opportunity to do this Warby Parker store in North Carolina. So these are like they still have not sent me the best possible documentation of this. But anyway, it's that similar sort of style as those other murals, and it kind of wraps around the back of the building. And then I also designed these in-store graphics, or that you sort of see from inside and outside, and the eyes are centered in the middle of all of these, but then the shape kind of is around it. So it's this kind of like, polymorphous kind of glasses-wearing character that kind of evolves. So that's a kind of, let's see, kind of see them there. And then some of those forms I've also used like for record covers as well, and some book covers. So as I was doing the paintings a few years ago, I was interested in returning to, I'm always trying to find the cheapest way to make art, basically, because like it's expensive to make stuff, especially when you're doing photography and those kinds of things, printing stuff. And I've like resent that sometimes. Or when you like spend like $1,000 on a show and then no one buys anything. So there's always part of me, and like why I did those spider banners is because I could do these big things but make them like, because it was fabric, like super cheaply. And so I started to start using old clothes and stuff, which I'd done a little bit before, and I'd done one specific installation was using old sheets. But I thought I would just, like, this is like a cable knit sweater, I don't know if you can see that. But I started to use like the language for my paintings, but in a fabric form. So like this is what those pieces look like. And some of this, like I went to my parents' house and I found like old tablecloths and curtains and like literally some of these things I think had like food on them from like eating dinner in the 80s. And I cut up like my old corduroy pants and like sweaters and things. And then it was bringing a sort of different materiality into the work. And I think the way I think of these pieces the paintings and these pieces are, I think, the way I imagine, like the way this art works for me, is that like for any of these images, I kind of have like a platonic ideal of it that can be rendered in different forms, like whether that's like a digital print or in fabric or as a painting, and they all change as you change the medium, but like somehow that main idea is the central thing to me. So this is where you can see like you can see my scraps and stuff, and it's all, you sort of put this adhesive on the back and then cut up the shapes and iron them on. But it was another thing that kind of just like opened different doors. And I did end up doing this show with Maison Kitsune, which is like a French-Japanese fashion brand, where they had me like hang these in they have a little gallery in their store in the West Village. So I had a show of this work, and it kind of connected, obviously, because they're dealing with clothes and fabric. But it was also, I like the idea of using things that would just be thrown away and kind of giving them this weird second life. So anyway, so that's like sort of a summary of some of my bigger projects, and there are many other like sort of sub-projects I didn't talk about. But so this summer I had a show which was a mid-cure retrospective, which was meant to, I was approached the Birchfield with this idea, and they were into it. And for me, I wanted to be able to, because so much of the work that I do is the projects are very different from one another. And I'm in the situation where a lot of the people that follow me now, I have a lot of Instagram followers, and I think almost none of them even know that the Stray Shopping Cart project exists. Like, they just know me from this other work that I've done in the last 10 years. Which on one hand, like, it's cool that I was able to like kind of like build a following without that other initial notoriety. But on the other hand, it's also just like kind of, I knew there was, to kind of produce a picture of myself as an artist, I really wanted to have a show where I could put it all together and see how it all fits together, like for myself as well. So in this image, you can see that that in the foreground is that book I mentioned, or I showed you the paper cuts of the bird beaks. But the main feature, so the way the show worked, it's hard to photograph. It's quite an interesting space at the Birchfield. So that large curved wall there, look at it here. I put larger works there, and they're all mixed up from all different bodies of work. And for the most part, it was all for the first time, like things that I'd never seen together. So it's like paintings, it's photographs that aren't even associated with specific projects. It's like photographs from the Spider Project, different early work involved like paper cuts of insects and so forth. But this was a way to kind of put it all up there in one go and just like to see what happens. I spent weeks and weeks sort of arranging in the mock-up like where everything went. And I think ultimately like you just have to at some point stop that process and just like hang it on the wall and see what happens. Which I was largely happy with. And even in some ways I like found these other kind of formal connections between things that I hadn't fully realized were there, which was cool. But then on these tables down here, all the fake books and booklets and so forth. The shopping cart project's here. There's a guide down there. That table is there's a guide with explanations to all the different projects and what they are, so you can kind of know what it is that you're looking at in the show. The fake Thorold Gallery posters are there on the right, going up the wall. One of the shopping carts that's been with me like since for a very long time that I've hauled around, and my landlord almost threw out a couple times, but made it to the museum. So the painting and the fabric work are hanging there together. These are these large mirrors I'd done of spider faces, part of an installation. So that's kind of reflecting back the rest of the gallery. And then the hallway going in was all the graphic design and client work. So that was kind of included there as well. Obviously, it caused a lot of confusion having like all these fake posters and fake books and people not knowing what was the real design and fake design, which is a little bit frustrating. The most frustrating part is that I wanted, you can be as confused as you want, but just like understand that I made all that stuff as opposed to just like put it in there. Like that made me mad. But I didn't want to have a ton of text on the wall. I wanted the text to be on that display table because it wouldn't be, it's already so busy. With a view from up high. But this exhibit, I think, had over 400 different items in it, which is the most of any one single show at the Birchfield. And I used, I should have talked about it earlier, you can see I'm using like a grid system here for all of these different things. And the main wall is gridded as well. And this is gridded. So I took, really you can see it there. I took a 1/4 inch black painter's tape. And I made, so everything was laid out. I mean, everything was laid out ahead of time. Like I knew where every single piece was going. But the grids allowed me, particularly on the big wall, which you can see corner of it here, they're all the same size. They're all, I think, 5 feet by 5 feet squares. But it worked very well in that you had all this disparate work. And to tie it together but have it not feel too crowded or too muddy, they all needed their own sort of space. So with everything centered in the box of the grid, it really helped to clarify. And I think ultimately worked like really well. Like I think I'm going to do this again in the next time I have a show. Because it gives you a lot of freedom. I mean, on one hand, my initial conception was hanging this work in a much more like kind of as a cloud of stuff. But I don't think that would have worked. It would have been interesting, but each individual piece would have been sort of sacrificed for this like blob of stuff. And I think that this grid system really worked. Like I feel like this is kind of a big swing because it's like you're putting so much stuff out there that you're definitely open to criticism of like overkill and whatever, and which is totally fine. But I do feel that like with many of these projects, the volume is important. Like it's one thing to like photograph like a shopping cart or a few shopping carts and do 10 shopping carts, but like it's like when you have like hundreds of shopping carts, they change. The meaning of it changes, like how you see it changes. Same with the fake posters. It's like one thing to make a couple fake posters, but like when you have like 100, well I think I have 90 fake books here. It gets weirder the more you know that I've gone that far. I think in the way that the audience sort of perceives it. So volume is very important for me to get that into the show. And ultimately, like I'm happy with how it turned out. Like I think it hopefully wasn't too upsetting to people. But okay, so that's I guess my basic presentation. So, are there any questions? Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah.
I'll raise the lights, and we can begin the Q&A. That was wonderful.
Oh.
All right, so fire away with questions.
Okay, wait. So, do I materialize things because wait? What was? I think it's like, you mean like out in the world? Sorry. I think it is like I think the base desire is like I want to make something that I want to see. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, like that's like the driving force, and that feeling of like realizing it and like seeing it physically is like it's a deeply satisfying feeling. I don't know like how much it can inspire other people or things to do anything, but yeah, that's my answer. Yeah, what's the second part? No, I definitely think I've gained appreciation for people I didn't understand, like painters I didn't understand before. Like one of my things I resisted in painting before was sometimes just the like heavy-handed claims that like art critics and art historians made for various artists, where like I have total respect for all these like where all these things fit in art history and why they're important. But sometimes, especially when you're also coming with like a lot of respect for design, which doesn't get much respect, and like some of these people making these book covers are like making like these like stunning like abstract compositions, and then it's like everyone's just like pouring barrels of ink out to write about like whatever Barnett Newman or something. So there's a little bit of like resistance there, and part of it is because I'm interested in kind of having a diverse practice and doing all these different things. there are some people it's like hard, like I really like Ellsworth Kelly's work, but I will say it's like hard to identify with like such a focused practice. Do you know what I mean? Just from a personality point of view, it's like I can't quite see like working with those same elements for 70 years or whatever. But I will say like my process of doing these paintings has opened me up to that more. Do you know what I mean? I understand more what people are after. I understand more that and a lot of the people I'm fans of are kind of are weirdly like there are a lot of sculptures that I like are kind of inspirations to me, even though I do almost no sculpture. But like there's something about those elemental forms, or that idea of kind of getting to some sort of like really super simple base thing is obviously like something I'm interested in. So that's happening in a lot of that, or happens in a lot of that painting from the kind of modernist type people that are still working in the 70s and stuff. Or kind of like, I don't know. So there's definitely stuff I would have dismissed before that I'm now more sensitive to, for sure. An object or like a medium? Oh yeah. Well, a friend of mine is like wants me to do a car like where he's got a pretty cool car in the works that like so it'd be cool to do graphics for a car, but in a way that it's sort of an interesting challenge, like I mean, there's some interesting examples in the past, like where like Alexander Calder did like I forgot if it was a Porsche or something. There's these famous like art cars from the 70s where like some of these famous painters did these graphics on cars, and like it's really hard to do, right? Because the car itself has its own design, and like how do you make something that works with that and doesn't like step on it? So I'm kind of curious about that process if I end up doing this car with this guy. We'll do like a wrap, and like to make it actually look cool and not just like I don't know. I haven't done it yet, so I don't know. But I'm kind of curious if it can be made, if it can work. So that's one thing. So, yeah, I usually, I mean, it depends on what it is, but I usually throw around, I mean, there's a lot of like, I guess what you'd call like a sketching process, basically. I've learned that like, usually, I just heard some advice the other day that like your first ideas are always going to be bad, and but you have to get them out before you can come back to the other ideas. I hadn't heard that before, but like now it is kind of true. Like part of the process I've realized is like stepping back from the stuff that I've made and like coming back to it, because you just see like when you have to do a job really fast, it's hard. Really a job that requires a lot of creative thought. Because you can't see clearly when you've been working on it for a while, and like stepping away is super important. But I tend to generate a lot of drafts. Like when I'm working on book covers, I also I have like I save lots of graphics, like the graphics that I use for one project that don't get used. I put into like my Adobe libraries. Excuse me. So I have this like bag of tricks that like is like often a starting point. Well, like go into my like Adobe library of like some graphic I made for some little thing, maybe just some combination of shapes where I'm like, maybe this is a starting point for something else. So there's this kind of generative thing of like all the refuse from one job like kind of goes into this file that then can be like the starting point for the next job. And then there's some like ideas where I'm like, I've been trying to make this one idea into a book cover forever, where I'm just like, hey, do you like this? And I would never like it or whatever. But like, so some of them like, oh, I don't want to like just be completely cannibalizing myself all the time. But I do think that it's like that process, saving the stuff on the sides is really important, because like you don't know how it's going to pay off later, or how you're going to see it differently, or So I've been really, especially the last few years, really conscientious about just like storing graphic ideas. Yeah. Yeah. I think. Well, the thing is, everything is saturated, but like you have to like ignore that and keep going, because it's like if you think about how much of everything there is, you'll never go anywhere. But I think doing like even when you get a job or whatever, like most jobs are not interesting in entry-level graphic design jobs. Or I mean, in the sense that you're not doing very creative things, right? Like, but having your own like self-initiated projects going on the side, I think is super important. And when I was starting out, there was no place to put that stuff. You know what I mean? There wasn't Instagram or Facebook or any of those things. So like, you could have a self-initiated project, as the shopping cart thing initially was, and I put it in a zine, right? Like there was no place to, there's almost no place to show things. So like the great thing about the moment that we're in is you could put that work out there, and like people don't care if they like an idea or a style or whatever, where it came from, or if it was a real job or not when they look at it. And I think that like doing self-initiated stuff is like super important. Plus, it's like how you learn. Like you don't, if you are interested in going forward in design and doing interesting creative jobs, like you're going to only get a percentage of that on the job. You know what I mean? Like you have to do it on your own, which also means like studying graphic design, looking at a lot of graphic design on your own, and then just making stuff, because like you can't, it's just like the only way, you know? And like you're just not probably going to have a job that's going to give you enough of that. So I think it's like the people that get to do the fun stuff eventually are the people that are putting in a lot of extra, like their own time into making things on the side. Yeah, I mean, I think that's all like stuff that it's all learning that, you know what I mean, isn't wasted, I don't think, to learn about those things. And I mean, I end up like dealing with a lot of different kinds of clients, you know what I mean, ultimately. And all those things you learn along the way are useful. I do think, sorry about the coughing. I do think like it is good in going out into the workplace or whatever. Like being proficient in some programs is super important. I mean, I would say, you know, for the basic graphic design stuff like the Adobe Suite, you know, or just like the Photoshop, InDesign, and Illustrator, like that's what makes you useful like in a job. And it is like being fluid in those things is just makes everything better. And let alone all the others. I mean, and that's, I mean, depends on what you want to do. Like there's so many other things to learn too. But like I think having as much experience in the tools as you can get is just, it does make things easier as you go forward. It makes you useful to people, you know, because that's what they want. When you start a job, like no one wants your super creative ideas from someone who's just starting out. They want you to be like, they want to be able to tell you what to do and you can do it. Now, like, maybe all these jobs are going to get replaced by AI in the next 6 months, so like I hope that's not the case. But for a while, like hopefully there's still some boring graphic design jobs that like are getting people in the door. But yeah. Yeah, like I only have a glancing reference to like my bird photography project. Like I'd done this thing where when I was photographing shopping carts, well, I often like photograph birds at the same time, but like not with a long lens or anything, just the lens that I had on the camera, which is pretty much like human eye distance. So, because I'd noticed all these like pictures in my old film things when I was younger and a kid, like it'd be a picture of a bird, but it's just like a speck in the frame, and I was kind of interested in that, the desire of like trying to capture nature, like you see something and you're like, I got to take a picture of it, even if it's like a complete waste of time because it's not going to be a good picture. So I started photographing birds like kind of from a great distance, and that was had a show of that work. But that like here, I didn't like. There's one of the big prints. There's a big print down there of a Cooper's hawk flying in a backyard, that's from that project, but it doesn't like directly. And I reference it, I think, in the layout, but it's just a glancing reference. But I managed to get a lot of the stuff on the big wall to reference, like just one piece from different projects. But so I feel like I kind of edited out like a full showing of a bunch of things, but at least got a reference in. But I did have to pick, what I thought was like most important. Yeah, I mean, so I think that, you know, um, in my mind, the difference between art and design, is very simple in the sense that, like, if it's like I'm doing something in the service of a client's ideas, like that is more on the design end or more on the illustration end. And if I'm doing it in service of my own ideas, then it's like art. The gradations to it, in the sense like I think of like contemporary art as the things that I do are like that are a little more conceptual or a little more traditional, like in the paintings and so forth. And then the other stuff like the Warby Parker murals and stuff like that's like somewhere in that middle zone where like with Warby Parker, like they had no notes. I just like designed the thing and they're like, let's do it. So it wasn't even like a traditional client thing of like, hey, can you change this or do this or whatever. So that's a thing where, which is happening more and more where, the artist is in collaboration with the company. And now you're seeing really big, people that are big Chelsea galleries and stuff, like will be doing like a collab with a luxury brand or whatever. So when I started out, the idea of that commercial world, there's the idea of the artist being like kind of pure, and then doing this other stuff was like kind of dirtier, and like if you were a designer and you were an artist, like you didn't want to talk about that with the art people because like I had some like pretentious painter like tell me like you can't do both things at the same time, like this idea you'd like kind of sully yourself. I'm sure he like had a trust fund or whatever, but and then there was also the idea in design, it's like, oh, you don't want to be too much of an artist because you want to be adaptable to the different clients and not just bring your own style to everything that you do. But now there's like this hybrid middle part, which I'm trying to be in, where it's like, the artist is doing the collab with the brand. So it's like it's not a nameless guy generating graphics. It's like, here's an artist who's going to like do this thing for our brand, which is, I think, better. I think it's good. I mean, it's still selling stuff and whatever. It's not great, but like the art side of it has always been weird too, because it's like, well, you're making these pieces and then like some wealthy person's going to buy it and then you'll never see the piece again. And you know what I mean? It's sort of it's this other sort of side of the capitalist coin that's actually ultimately less democratic, because like when you do these projects with companies, like people see them, like random people walk past the work and see it and engage with it, which to me is more appealing than like a guy putting my painting in storage somewhere. So I kind of like, I'm happy that so in answer to your initial question, it's like they're these like, they're overlapping at the edge, essentially, the art and the design. And I think it's getting like a little more fluid. And I'm happy that now like people at least can understand the idea of like someone engaging in both. And it's also happening too where like, because there's just the way people are talking about like, you have these music people doing like going to like fashion houses and stuff, and there's sort of this weird like sort of bleed through of different kind of creative practices.
Thanks for your talk, Julian. I'm intrigued by your spider project. Um, you took an original entity, you abstracted it as a graphic, and then you placed that graphic in place of the original. Can you talk more about why you made that choice? To me, it seems like a memorializing of the spider.
It is, yeah. There's a sort of this memorial to the spider too, and just the sort of like, and just that it physically just like expanding the presence of the thing. It sort of gets to the fact that it's very hard to see. It's so difficult to see these things, these spiders, right? And it takes, and so you can't look at a whole room and like see what's happening in it with the spiders. You have to go look very closely, and somehow like the idea of kind of, I wanted it to be staged with almost like some kind of like pageantry or something. Do you know what I mean? Like, or I wanted there to be some kind of, I can't quite put my finger on what it is, but I wanted like some kind of like dramatic presentation, of this very minute drama that's happening kind of at the edges of things. Like originally I'd made some with like more of these like kind of like black tassels on them and stuff, like sort of playing with this idea of them being, I don't know, more like almost like a religious kind of thing. I think crossed my mind a little bit, but I didn't sort of pursue that and kept them simple. But they definitely wanted them to be, the sort of like dark and odd. But yeah, quasi. In that project, you don't really know this investigator who's doing it, this other version of me or whatever. I feel like you don't really understand why he's doing it, or that's how I think of it. It's a little oblique. Oh, these are back there. Yeah, that's all made up, yeah. And like the names of the authors are like, it's all like, initially it was like recombinations of people I knew's names, like flipping, but then some of them are like exits, like there's one like Pembroke Medina is one of the authors, and that's like an exit on the 90. Dunmore Throop, that's like an exit down in Pennsylvania near New York. So like I'm always like at a certain point started looking for like these name combinations and would write down these various things. Um, it goes both ways. So that's the thing. It's like sometimes it's like I have an idea for a title and then I make the graphic, and then sometimes I have the graphic and I make the title, which is I think I mean I guess I should have said this earlier. Like one of the things clearly, if you look at my work, that I'm just super interested in is the way that like words and images interact, which is what I like about book covers and record covers and posters, is you have a very small amount of text and an image, and those two things change each other. And I really like that process, or I'm fascinated by like what that process can be, because it takes so little, and even sometimes with the names, it's like finding the right name for these fake artists just somehow like makes the thing work in a way that's not like logical. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of just weirdly intuitive, because like people's names are not, they're random, right? But like somehow there's a name that feels right for some like weird 70s European artist, and it kind of like makes the work. So like I think the poster is a form I'm always kind of coming back to in some way or another. Like even kind of like a lot of my paintings are kind of oriented, like vertically. But yeah, words and images I think is kind of one